Hi, Alec.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Great, thank you.
So you're litigating some of the major bail cases in the country right now. For those of us who might not be familiar, how does bail work in the country right now?
So to understand the American money bail system, I think it's really important just to take a step back and understand the scope of the pain that it's inflicting first. So as we sit here and talk today, there are about 500,000 human beings in a jail cell confined in pretrial detention. The vast majority of those human beings are in a jail cell prior to trial because they can't make a monetary payment. The reason for that money bail connection with pretrial detention is that the vast majority of the people that our legal system chooses to investigate and arrest and prosecute and confine are impoverished. And in 3,000 local jurisdictions all over the country, the predominant way in which we decide whether to put a human being in a jail cell or to let her go home with her family is whether she can come up with money. So the basic way that it works when you're arrested is probably best illustrated by an example. So I'll talk about our Harris County case in Houston, Texas. When we got to Harris County in 2016, if you were arrested for a misdemeanor or a felony offense, you were told, you're free to go anytime. Just pay us some amount of money that was on a chart based on what you were charged with. And so if you didn't have the $500, if you didn't have the $1,000, you were confined to a jail cell. In the 5 years before we sued Harris County in 2016, 55 human beings died in the Harris County jail alone in downtown Houston because they couldn't afford to pay money bail. That year, there were 132 suicide attempts in the Harris County jail. It's really important to understand in the frantic and difficult and traumatic moments after you're arrested and told you're free to go back to your family, I'm trying to understand what it means to someone who can't get back to their families just because they can't hand Harris County some money. And so all over the country, we've been going around making a very simple argument. And that argument has lots of constitutional bells and whistles and technicalities and legal cases that we cite, but at the core, the argument is that no human being should be kept in a cage because she can't make a payment.
It's clear that the system doesn't work. When you're thinking about priorities, you talked about the bells and the whistles. What is the highest priority part of the system that needs to be reformed, in your opinion?
To me, I think first and foremost, it's the immense brutality that we're inflicting every single day. It's gotten to the point where it's so normalized that in 3,000, I remember when we told people 5 years ago we were going to start challenging the money bail system, people laughed at us because they would say, we're using it in 3,000 jurisdictions, that's what we do, this is how we do it can't be wrong. And yet, when you go into a jail and you see the kinds of things that happen to people in their bodies there, you have to remember, when you're kept in a jail cell because you can't pay money bail, you're highly likely to be sexually or physically assaulted, to be deprived of basic medical and mental health care, to be deprived of sunlight and fresh air, adequate food, all of the things that we all take for granted every single day, and more, right? I mean, we've talked a lot in the last year or year and a half about family separation at the border. Well, families are being separated every single day in every single city and town in this country because people can't pay money bail prior to their trial, prior to being convicted of anything. This family separation is happening to millions of families every single, and to me, that is an urgent situation that cries out. It cries out for all of us to understand the ways in which we're complicit, the ways in which the money bail system is functioning, and the ways in which we could very easily have a much more rational and humane system that didn't cage people just because they were poor. So for me, the highest priority is changing the narrative around the country to get people to understand what does it mean to tell someone that for the next 3 months or 5 months or 8 months or a year, not only can't you work or go back to your home or hug your child or go on a date or go to the theater, but you're going to be kept in this place that we have allowed to become a grotesque torture chamber, where any day you might be beaten, or any day you might get sick because of the lack of fresh air or exercise, and not be able to have an adequate doctor because we've privatized the healthcare in this facility. All of the things that we take for granted. And so for us at Civil Rights Corps, it's not just about making the best constitutional arguments, and we make really good constitutional arguments. We have some of the best arguments, as some might say. But we try fundamentally on a much more human level to change the cultural narrative. Because if you think back to some of the same-sex marriage cases, for example, very smart lawyers brought those cases 30, 35 years ago. They lost everywhere. They lost in the US Supreme Court on that issue. 25, 28, 30 years later, more lawyers came. They brought the same arguments about same-sex marriage to the same courts using the same few words in the 14th Amendment. and they won in the US Supreme Court. It wasn't because those lawyers were smarter than the previous lawyers. Some of them were the same lawyers. It was because we had a movement in this country that changed the way we all think about same-sex marriage. And what we're trying to do is be part of a movement that's predominantly led by the people who are most directly impacted by the money bail system and the rest of the punishment bureaucracy, to change the way all of us think about human caging, and to make sure that as a society, before we put someone in a cage and do all of the things that that entails, we better have the most profoundly good reasons. And if we don't have a good reason, and not having money in your pocket is not a good reason. And we're trying to eradicate and abolish all of these systems, but starting with the systems that are founded on the racial and economic makeup of our society, and that make these decisions because of who people are and what they look like and how much wealth they have.
You look at these cases all over the country, and California was the first state to eliminate its cash bail system. Can you talk a little bit about the example that set for other states that are trying to follow in the footsteps of eradicating these policies?
I wish California were a positive story, but I think California is actually an example of why we should all be very afraid, and why we're at a very dangerous moment in what is called the criminal justice reform movement. So California legislators got together and through a process that was highly secretive, essentially converted a pretty ambitious bail reform bill that would have eliminated the money bail industry and prevented a lot of pretrial detention. And at the last minute kind of substituted that with a bill that eliminates the money bail system in California, but replaces it with one that is highly likely to lead to more pretrial detention. Why is this important? I think if you don't understand the fundamental causes of why something like the money bail system developed, and I'll get to those causes in a second, I don't think you can come up with the right solutions. So what I'm very fearful of is that the system of money bail that we have in this country is going to morph into a system of pretrial detention, and that all of the people who are making money off the money bail system, like the multi-billion-dollar-a-year for-profit money bail industry, those same people, instead of selling you the bail bond, if you get out of jail, they're going to be selling you drug tests and electronic monitors so they can monitor everywhere you go and attach a device to you for $10 a day. And they're going to sell you for-profit supervision. So we're going to have all of the same people making all of the same or more money off the same impoverished populations, but using a different label. And this, I think, is the story of a lot of legal reform movements. Like, when we announced this landmark settlement in Harris County, Texas, Rodney Ellis, the prominent local legislator, likened it to Brown versus Board of Education. But one thing that you have to understand about Brown as a legal case, you can win a case that says it's unconstitutional to segregate schools. But 5 years after Brown, 10 years after Brown, 40 years after Brown, 60 years after Brown, you can actually have more segregation in much of the country in schools if you don't attack the underlying structural causes. So for the money bail system, what are the underlying structural causes of how we got to the point where, as a society, we have 400 to 500,000 human beings in a jail cell every night just because they can't pay? Right? It sounds ridiculous when you actually look at it. When you talk to ordinary people, their mind is blown that we even have this. It's only lawyers that can come up with fancy explanations for why we created the system. Why did we create it? Well, one, I mentioned the profit motive. There's a lot of money to be made off impoverished people. The more, I think, fundamental point, though, is that no society in the recorded history of the modern world has ever tried to arrest such a high percentage of its population. When you arrest so many people, 12 million people every year, we're putting metal chains on, and we're putting them in police cars, and we're taking them to caging facilities, and we're processing them, and we're charging many of them with crimes. And no legal system that has ever been devised in world history can provide each one of those 12, 13 million people, depending on how you count, with the level of evidentiary, intellectual, and human rigor that it would require to give individual attention to all of their cases. What does our system do instead? It tries to process cases as fast as possible. It tries to process bodies. And the two things that the system has created that are most effective at that is the money bail system and the plea bargaining system. So well over 95% of cases all over the country end in plea bargains. How do we get so many people to take a bargain to get a criminal record, to get saddled with debt, and to spend time in a cage? Well, you put them in a cage and you tell them the only way or the quickest way to get out of that cage is to plead guilty. And so to take the Harris County example, again, like when we got there, they arrested 50,000 people, a little bit more, for misdemeanors every single year just in Harris County, Texas. 40% of them, over 20,000 people every single year, were detained for the entire duration of the case because they didn't have a couple $100s. Those 20,000 people, they pled guilty in a median of 3.2 days. So no attention was being given to their case. They didn't have a lawyer investigating their case or an investigator. No one was looking at what was going on. They didn't have discovery that was exchanged. They could see what the allegations were. They were told at their first court date, if you can pay money, you're released. They couldn't pay money, so they were kept in jail. And then at their next court date, in a couple of days, they were told if you want to get out of jail, and the vast majority of them did, plead guilty. You'll get out today or tomorrow.
So does that make lawmakers and judges kind of complicit in the system as it operates?
It makes all of us complicit. This is happening in all of our names. There's no question that lawmakers and judges and prosecutors and public defenders and all of us who've worked in the system have been complicit in it. I worked as a public defender for 4.5 years in 2 of the most prestigious offices in the country. And to my knowledge, neither of those 2 offices filed a single bail appeal in the entire 4.5 years I was there. We all became so desensitized to how brutal it is to put a human being in a cage. And think about what that means for people going through the system. The people who could afford money bail in Harris County, the 30,000 people who paid a for-profit bail bond company a few $100s, so they extracted about $6-7 million a year in wealth from those populations. But those people who could pay, they were 51% likely to never get convicted of anything. That's the 2 justice systems that we had, and their cases lasted 120 days. So the rich who could afford to get out of jail, their cases, and the reason the money bail system was created is that the system couldn't possibly give that kind of attention to all of the people that it's arresting. And so unless we confront those underlying dynamics, I'm very, very worried that we'll see something like what happened in California. And to take your question back to California, one of the most pernicious aspects of the California law is that it tries to expand who is eligible to be detained prior to trial. So it says, we're not going to detain you because you're poor, but we're going to expand the reasons and the types of cases that we can just detain you for no reason, or any reason, right? Because you're dangerous, or because you're a risk of flight. And moreover, we're going to let prosecutors and judges decide to delay 9 business days if they want until you even have a hearing about whether you're dangerous or a flight risk. So there's a reason why many counties in California estimated that their jail populations would increase after this. And I think the precedent for this is very chilling. There was a federal bail reform movement. A lot of people like me coming out in the 1960s, fancy lawyers saying, this is so unfair and unjust, and we've got to get rid of cash bail in the federal courts. Bobby Kennedy led this movement, right? Lyndon Johnson spoke about it at the White House. They had panels of judges. The federal system, when the federal system eventually ended the money bail system in federal courts with the Bail Reform Act of 1984, when that act went into effect, about 24% of all federal criminal defendants were detained prior to trial because they couldn't afford bail. A really serious problem. Today, as I sit here talking to you, we don't detain people anymore in federal court because they can't pay. But 72.4% of all federal criminal defendants are detained prior to trial. So we got rid of the money bail issue, but we tripled the rate at which people were detained in federal court. And it's the same populations that we're arresting and detaining. It's disproportionately people of color and almost all poor people. That's what I'm afraid of.
I have a final question for you. Money bail has often been referred to in its early iterations as something that was done for public safety. And we kind of know that that is not necessarily true. What would it take to reimagine a system that does take public safety as its kind of first and foremost goal?
Yeah, so the whole criminal punishment bureaucracy has been sold to us as a matter of public safety. When you actually look at what's going on in that bureaucracy, that's laughable, right? Only 4% of the arrests, according to the FBI in this country, are for things that the FBI calls violent offenses. The vast bulk of the criminal punishment bureaucracy is controlling certain populations and managing other types of social problems like mental illness and drug addiction and poverty. So it's just a false narrative to begin with for many reasons that we don't have time to get into here. In terms of the money bail system, it's even more ridiculous because if everybody who even thinks about it for a second understands that paying some money doesn't make you safe. If you were someone who believed that there was someone dangerous, why in the world would you think that them paying you $100, which they don't even lose if they commit a crime? You can't actually lose your money bail even if you commit a murder while you're out on release. The only way you lose your money bail is if you don't come back to court. What we know from all of the research, actually, is that keeping someone in jail for just a couple of days, even 24 hours, 48 hours, makes them more likely to commit crime in the future and more likely not to appear in court in the future. Why? Because you've destabilized their life. you've maybe not, I can take an afternoon off to come to the Atlantic Ideas Festival. I'm not going to get fired from our organization, I don't think. But many of my clients, as a public defender and as a civil rights lawyer, they can't miss 2 days of shifts. If they get jailed because they can't pay $100, they're going to lose their job. They might lose their bed in the homeless shelter. They might lose their housing. Many of them don't have any idea where their children are. These are the kinds of things that destabilize lives. If you're on very important medication for an illness or a mental health issue and you get interrupted for 2, 3, 4, 6 days and put in a traumatic environment, that can send you into a spiral that can have enormous effects. And so that's why all of the research shows there are so many better ways that we can address the trauma and pain and poverty and the reasons that people find themselves in our vast criminal punishment bureaucracy. We don't need to cage them because they're poor.
Alec, thank you so much.
Thank you.